He is above the law, but when his target fights back, karma is unforgiving. And when that happens, the entire courtroom falls into stunned silence. The day began like any other in the federal courthouse. Or rather, almost like any other, because Judge James Garcia was already in a foul mood. I said, "No coffee in my courtroom," he barked at his clerk, who recoiled in alarm. And he didn't stop there. He turned to the defense team and snapped, "If you're not here in 2 minutes, I'm going to issue contempt charges." The gallery watched in silence as Garcia settled into his seat. His face was already flushed with irritation. He had always been known for his harsh treatment, but lately something seemed different. His behavior had become increasingly erratic, especially when it came to cases involving conservative figures. It was then that the clerk cautiously approached. "Your Honor, Vice President Vance has arrived for your testimony." Garcia's expression changed instantly. "Well, isn't that special?" he scoffed, not even trying to hide his disdain. "Make sure he knows this isn't the Senate floor. In my courtroom, his title means nothing." The atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavy as J.D. Vance entered. He moved with dignity, nodding respectfully to the courtroom staff. But Garcia kept his eyes on him, drumming his fingers impatiently on the table. "Let's get something straight," the judge announced, his voice thick with contempt. "I don't care what position you hold in Washington. In this court, I am the law." The vice president remained calm and responded measuredly. "That's clear, Your Honor." But this answer only irritated Garcia even more. "Crystalline, Mr. Vance?" He scoffed. "We'll see about that." And then his eyes turned to the defense table. "Now let the circus begin." The defense attorney had barely begun his opening statement when he was interrupted. "I've had enough of your political theatrics." He glared at Vance. "This is not a campaign rally." The attorney tried again. "Your Honor, we're just establishing the context of Mr. Sterling and his charity." But before he could continue, Garcia let out a dry laugh. "Context? The context is that your client is accused of tax evasion. Period. I don't need a history lesson about his alleged charity work." Every time the lawyer tried to mention Sterling's community contributions, Garcia would cut him off mercilessly. But what no one expected was that, minutes later, the tables would turn in spectacular fashion. "So, what do you think happened next? Was the judge really above the law, or was that going to change quickly? Comment below with your opinion." The growing hostility in the courtroom was palpable. "Move on. I won't warn you again." Judge James Garcia banged his gavel. So often that the court reporter could barely keep up. When it came time for Vance to testify, Garcia's behavior became even more erratic. "Stand up straight when you're sworn in," he snapped, though Vance's posture was impeccable. "And speak clearly. I will not tolerate political doublespeak in my courtroom." Vance kept his cool. "Your Honor, I can attest to Mr. Sterling's financial transparency regarding the Faith and Family Foundation." "Oh, here we go." Garcia interrupted, rolling his eyes theatrically. "Another conservative fairy tale about family values." The gallery murmured uncomfortably. Even the prosecution seemed uneasy about the judge's obvious bias. But Garcia was just getting started. He leaned forward, his face hard. "Let me make something clear. I've seen wealthy conservatives try to hide their money behind charitable facades. Your presence here does not impress me, Mr. Vice President. In fact, it makes me question the defendant's character even more." Vance remained composed, which seemed to irritate Garcia even more. The judge shuffled through his papers, his hand shaking slightly, his eyes darting nervously to specific documents on his desk. "I have here," Vance continued firmly, "documented evidence of Mr. Sterling's charitable contributions, including the March Foundation meetings. These records are inadmissible." Garcia shouted, without any objection having been raised. His reaction was oddly personal, almost desperate. The defense attorney stood up. "Your Honor, on what basis?" Garcia slammed his gavel down. His face was now bright red. "You dare not question my decisions. One more word, and you will join your client in contempt." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. This was no longer just judicial rigor. It was feeling personal. "Your Honor, Vance said loudly, standing his ground. These documents were duly submitted during discovery. Oh, where were they? Garcia scoffed. And I assume your fancy White House connections had nothing to do with this? He then leaned in even closer, his voice thick with venom. Let me tell you something, Mr. Vice President. You think you can walk into my courtroom with your political privilege and... Objection, Your Honor, the defense attorney interrupted. That is completely inappropriate. Silence! Garcia roared, hammering the bench so hard it echoed through the courtroom. I will not be lectured in my own courtroom, especially by a conservative stooge and his... Your Honor, Vance interrupted calmly. Perhaps we should discuss the specifics of the March 15th meeting. The effect was instantaneous. The fury on Garcia's face gave way to something else fear. His hand froze in midair with the gavel. He stared at Vance as if seeing him for the first time. Those meetings are not relevant to these proceedings. His voice was uncertain now, but his eyes kept straying to a specific folder on his desk. Not relevant? Vance asked coldly. That's interesting, considering those meetings directly involved charitable contributions to... Bam! Garcia slammed both hands down on the bench. One more word about these meetings, and I'll have you removed. The entire courtroom fell silent. The judge's hands were visibly shaking as he desperately tried to regain control of the situation. In fact, Garcia continued, his voice taking on an almost manic tone, I'm holding you in contempt now. Do you think your position protects you? You're nothing more than a lackey of... Your Honor, Vance remained unfazed. My position has nothing to do with this. But since you mentioned protection, perhaps we should discuss the Liberty Foundation payments. Garcia's face went from red to white in an instant. How? How dare you? I mean, what payments? Guards, he shouted. Remove this man from my courtroom. But the court officials hesitated. They exchanged uncertain glances. The judge's behavior had crossed a line, and they all knew it. Vance picked up his briefcase, opened it, and held a few papers in the air. In fact, Your Honor, he said coldly, I have some very interesting bank records here. Would you like to explain the monthly deposits from offshore accounts that coincidentally align with your rulings against conservative defendants? The entire courtroom held its breath. Shut up, Garcia shouted, completely losing all semblance of judicial demeanor. You have no right. I am the law here. I am not a... And then the inevitable happened. But before we continue, what do you think happened next? Did the court side with Garcia, or did the truth finally come out? Comment below with your opinion. And if you want more stories like this, you know what to do. The only conspiracy here was the one he tried to hide. The FBI agent stepped forward calmly, but his authority was unquestionable. Judge James Garcia, you are under investigation for abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and federal corruption. The entire courtroom went still. Garcia instinctively recoiled, his eyes darting in every direction. His face, once flushed with fury, was now pale as a ghost. This is an outrage. You can't. We can and we will. The agent held up a warrant. We have more than enough evidence to take him in right now. The court officers finally moved, but not to arrest Vance. They turned to the judge. Garcia backed away even further, stumbling against his own bench. You're making a mistake. I'm the authority here. I decide what's right and wrong. No, Your Honor, Vance interjected, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. The law decides, and for the first time in a long time, it will finally be enforced. The entire courtroom held its breath. Then the clang of handcuffs echoed through the room. The gallery erupted in shocked gasps and gasps as Garcia was dragged away, struggling uselessly against the federal agents. This isn't over, he shouted, his voice now thick with pure desperation. I have connections. I'm going to take all of you down. But no one was listening anymore. Judge James Garcia, the man who for years had seen himself as untouchable, was being taken into custody in front of everyone he'd tried to silence. And this time, justice had finally prevailed. You think this changes anything? Garcia spat, his voice thick with bitterness, as the agents led him away, his handcuffed hands shaking. Vance remained calm, unfazed by the former judge's outburst of rage. "Yes, James. It changes everything." Garcia was dragged from the courtroom, his words fading into thin air, but the image of his downfall still lingered in the room. Justice had finally broken the cycle of corruption. As he was led to the halls, the courtroom witnessed the defeat of a rotten system where corrupt judges manipulated the law for their own ends. What Garcia didn't understand until the end was that he was no longer untouchable. Vance and the FBI agents had played his game, but with rules he didn't know. Garcia's face was pale, and for a moment, something very human flashed in his eyes. Fear. Fear of the truth. Fear of what he had become. Fear of what he had lost. And as the courtroom doors closed behind him, the silence that followed was deafening. A new era was beginning here. An era where corruption no longer found shelter, where justice was no longer a bargaining chip. Vance looked out at the gallery, his eyes now steady. He knew the road to restoring the justice system would be long, but this moment was a crucial first step. The battle was won, but the war was not over yet. The stage was set, and now the world would see the unfolding of what was about to happen. There will always be others like me. You can't stop us. Garcia shouted with hatred, his voice thick with contempt. But Vance, with the calm of someone who knows the battle is won, stepped forward and replied with unshakable firmness, "You're right about one thing." Garcia, expecting an emotionally charged answer, stopped, his breath coming in short gasps. Vance continued, with the force of truth, "There will always be those who abuse power, but there will always be those who stand against them. That is what keeps our system of justice alive. Not the corruption you represented, but the courage of those who stand against it." As Garcia was dragged away, his resistance crumbled in the face of the overwhelming evidence. The shadow he had cast over the courtroom, over justice, was dissipating, and with it, the web of corruption he had nurtured. Garcia's arrest was not just an end, it was a beginning for a movement that would transform the system. Investigations began to spread far and wide, and the network of corrupt judges he had commanded began to crumble. Every piece of evidence that emerged, every brave witness who stood up, showed the rot that had been exposed but was now being challenged. The most powerful moment, however, was when Sterling's case was thrown out. The new judge, reviewing the evidence that Garcia had desperately tried to suppress, found no basis for charges. Justice was restored, and it was at that moment that the true power of justice was revealed. It is not power that controls the truth, but those who have the courage to defend it. That was the final blow, and it was stronger than any judge's gavel. If you believe in the power of truth and the courage to fight for justice, like now and subscribe for more stories of resistance and overcoming. This is not just a story. It is the fight for justice.